Okay. Marvin Wolf, that guy over there. He's the author of 18 books?
Well, 18 under my name and 5 ghostwritten.
Okay. And we won't talk about those.
No.
Okay. All right. Marvin has had an amazing checkered life. I mean, you couldn't write a life as amazing as his.
But I have.
But he has, of course. And he's made money from it as well. But he's gone from being a paper boy, which wasn't recent,
No.
to being a multi-decorated war hero, including the Purple Heart. And that was not from running away and getting shot in the butt. Yes, he deserves every bit of that. And he's written some very iconic biographies, and then he's gone into being a rabbinical mystery writer. So it's like, I don't know how you even make up stuff like that. He is a charter member of IWAS. We have one founding member in the audience, Laura Myers, one of the founding members, Lodi's many years ago. And Marvin is a charter member. And what is the difference? What is a charter member?
Charter member is a person who joined at the very beginning of the organization. On the very first night of this organization, we met at the Los Angeles Press Club, the old Press Club, which is no longer there, on Vermont Avenue. And there were, to my recollection, somewhere north of 150 writers present. And each of us had received a postcard from Laura and her committee saying stuff like, we need a writers organization. If you want to know more about it, here's why. If you want to know more about this, come to this organization. And then come to this organizational meeting. And each of the founders got up in turn and talked about why we needed this organization. And then somebody said, if you want to join tonight, it's $25. Of course, we had to pay more later when we had a formal setup. So I was member number 26. I don't know what your member number was, but I was 26.
Got to be number one, right? Yeah. Okay, number one. Number one. Yeah.
Maybe three.
Maybe 3.
Depending on how you shuffled the check.
Yeah. 1, 3, same thing. So we've got history in the room, tons of it. Marvin is a renowned polymath. You'll have to look that up. I just learned the word myself. And his daughter Tommy is in the audience right there. Hi, Tommy. Yes. And since you are moving to North Carolina, I thought it only appropriate to present you with this corncob pipe. And I want you to read one warning. I want you to read out loud. In red, right there.
Keep away from open flame. I have to tell you, this is not my first corncob pipe. There was a period in my life when I thought I was MacArthur.
Okay, so we'll get into therapy a little later. All right. Okay. So now we're gonna. This debate is not going to be about personalities and nasty. It's going to be about the issues. Okay. So, Marvin, you just talked about collaborations, and I know you've done ghostwriting is a kind of collaboration. You've done quite a bit of collaborating. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that process. How you choose a collaborator, how you get along with a collaborator, how you get along legally with a collaborator, how you keep things from getting crazy, all those things.
Well, last things first, sometimes they just get crazy. In truth, I haven't gone looking for any collaborators. They've come looking for me. In every case, a different person with a different story has hunted me up and offered me a chance to tell their life story. And most of the time I say no thanks. In terms of the actual writing, it turns out that I have a gift. And now we have to go back 100 years, more than 100 years. I wasn't around. My father's father, my grandfather, Morris, who grew up in Romania, according to family lore, I have no documents on this, so this could all be a Bobomansa, an old wives' tale.
Look it up.
At the age of 9, he was orphaned in a pogrom in Bucharest and went to live with some relatives in Cape Town, South Africa. And as he entered his teen years, it developed that he had an ear for language, and he could speak, not read, but speak fluently, with some degree of fluency, 7 or 8 languages, a bunch of European languages, and Bantu and Swahili, which are 2 important languages in that part of the world. And he went to work as a teenager in a diamond mine about 300 miles from Cape Town as an interpreter. I have to tell you, this is a story that my mother told, not my father, although it's about my father's family. And when you're out in a diamond mine, you're a very remote location, and when you don't get to leave very often, and when you do, you're searched. Everybody is searched, even the managing director, everybody's searched, because they're little tiny things and they're very valuable. So it came to pass at some time, shortly after he arrived in this mining camp, that the camp dentist sent for him. He said, "How old are you?" And he said, "I'm 19. He said, "Well, you need to have your wisdom teeth out. If you have an impacted molar back out here, you could die before we get you to a hospital." So he pulled his 4 wisdom teeth and then went back for a follow-up visit a couple of weeks later. And the dentist took out a little box, and in the box were 2 of his 4 teeth, the rear molars, lower molars, that had been, the roots had been ground off. And he said, "Would you like to make some money?" And the scheme was, that if you put those molars back in your mouth, there's a little space underneath it, big enough to put a few diamonds in. So for some time, weeks or months, I don't know, whenever he went back to Cape Town, he carried those diamonds, and then later would meet up with the dentist. He was on a home visit, and the newspapers had a story about this dentist who'd been caught smuggling diamonds. And my grandfather said to himself, "Well, if they caught him, they'll catch me." There was a ship in the harbor, and he took it. The point of all this wasn't about the diamonds, although that would come back to haunt me another time. It's about the fact that he had an ear for language. When I was 8 or 9 years old, growing up in Chicago, my father was starting a junk business. He had a horse and a wagon, which he rented, and he'd go up and down the alleys, and he'd be yelling, "Rex, Solaya, my wagon's broken, my horse is croaking." And the housewives would come out, they'd bring their bundles of newspaper and their bundles of old clothes and their beat up old kitchenware, no Teflon in those days. And the thing that struck me was that my father seemed to, at the age of 6 or 7, my age, I thought that my father could speak many languages, because these people who were ethnic, hyphenated Americans, many of them first generation, would speak to him in Greek or Russian or German or Polish or whatever it was, and he'd speak back to them. And then, as I got into my late single digits, I realized that he wasn't speaking a foreign language, he was mimicking their accent. I didn't know that I had this gift until I was asked to write a book with Leonard Goldenson, who was the founder of ABC. And how that came about is another story, and maybe you'll ask me about it. But the point is, this was an older man. He was in his 80s at the time, and he is a Harvard-educated lawyer who spoke in a slow, measured way, sort of like an early Obama, choosing his words very carefully with proper diction, and quite frankly, it was boring. And my challenge was to make the book sound like him but not be boring. And somehow I was able to pull that off. The next book I did as a collaboration where we were doing a first person. And by the way, I want to distinguish between two types of collaborations. One is where I'm doing all the work. And the other person is just telling me stories or handing me documents or whatever. And a kind of collaboration where you divide up the work. One person does research, for example, and another person does the writing, and then the first person edits or makes commentary. And I've done both. My true crime books, 4 of my true crime books, which are anthologies, were done in that way. Catherine Mader, who is now a judge and was then a DA, deputy DA, did the research and I did the writing. But when it comes to collaborating with somebody on their life story, you have to try to sound like them, but better than them. You have to try to sound like they think they sound, or should sound. And the challenge, of course, is when you're working with someone who has a completely foreign language pattern. General Key, Win Kao Key, was the former Prime Minister of South Vietnam. I wrote a book with him about his wartime experiences called Buddha's Child. And his characteristics of his speech was quite dignified. The point is, I didn't have to do a lot of thinking about this. I just sat down at the keyboard and said, let me be Key's highest self, and I wrote. And it just sort of came out. I can't tell you how to do that. That's just what I do. The other part of the question is, how do you keep them from getting crazy? Well, you don't collaborate with somebody unless you are pretty sure that you can deal with them on an equal basis. And that has not always been my experience, but now that I know better, it will always be in the future, if there is a future for this in me. Legally, you need a signed agreement, and the best way to get a good, solid collaboration agreement is, if your agent doesn't have one, get an attorney. It's worth the money. And you have to specify who owns what, who does what, performs what part of the equation. And then you have to be prepared to do it all anyway.
And the attorneys, they have to be 2 separate attorneys in order to make that actually work. You can't have just one attorney.
You can have one attorney.
Well, it's better if you had 2.
I could only afford one.
I mean, you would only have one, and the other person would have their own. And that,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it's like a marriage.
As a conflict of interest.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so how did you happen to solve a 50-year-old murder? That's a different kind of subject than the murder.
Well, first of all, I was 52 years old at the time. My second book was a book called Fallen Angels, which is a history of LA crime from 1857, the Mexican-American War, up until 1986 is when the book came out. And one of the stories that we decided to write about was a story about the unsolved murder of Thelma Todd. It was a mystery, which at that time was not actually considered a murder. A coroner's jury, which we don't have anymore. We don't do the coroner's jury. It's actually a jury, and evidence is presented to them. They still do that in some parts of the country, but not here. A coroner's jury declared that this was death by unknown causes. They were not able to say whether it was murder or suicide or anything else. And my writing partner, Catherine Mader, Judge Mader, if you happen to go before a judge in the Century City courthouse, that might be her. She said, you know, I'll bet we could solve this. And I said, I don't think so. She said, no, I'll bet we could. And then just as I was getting ready to say, okay, let's find out, she got hired by the DA's office and wasn't able to do very much of the research. A little bit. But this turned out to be a blessing because I learned a great deal. We have to understand that the internet is a young creature. It's only 21 years old. And anything that happened before 1995 is not likely to be on the internet. And anything that happened in 1935, the original documents will not be on the internet unless somebody went through the trouble of putting them on the internet. For the most part, they're not. On the other hand, there are a great number of places where you can find documents. So the first thing that we did, and Kathy was helpful in this, is we got that coroner's report from the coroner's office, and we got the minutes, the transcript of the coroner's jury. The next thing that I did is I wanted to find out if there was any other contemporaneous information. And it turns out that the USC library has a wonderful research facility besides the normal library that has lots and lots of stuff in it. They have a facility in a warehouse on the other side of the 110 freeway, and included in that archive is the entire morgue of the old Los Angeles Herald. And it's all in paper. So the good news is you tell the librarian what you're looking for, you give her a name or a couple of names or whatever, and she will find it for you if it's in the morgue. For those of you who don't know, a morgue is a newspaper clipping file service before there was the internet. It's all paper. And every newspaper, when I was working for newspapers in the 60s and 70s, had a morgue. And when someone died, my first newspaper job was writing obits. So if someone died, my first job was to go down to the morgue and say, do we have a file on so-and-so? And if the answer was no, there probably wouldn't be an obit because the person was not well known. If the answer was yes, then they would bring me this file and I would have to go through it. So this is what I had to do for solving the Thelma Todd murder. And it was astonished to find out in looking at these newspaper clippings that everything that they said, all the testimony that was given at the coroner's jury is reported in the newspaper backwards. For example, there was an issue of scuffed slippers. Thelma Todd, before she died, had to walk up about 90 cement stairs to a garage where she was found dead behind the wheel of her car. The police came out, they found a policewoman. Why it had to be a policewoman is a whole other story. The same weight as Thelma Todd. They bought her a brand new pair of slippers and had her walk up those stairs. And then they compared the scuffing on the slippers. At the coroner's jury, they said that the scuffing was very, very similar. And their conclusion was that she had walked up those stairs. Now, she didn't have, operating from the fact that she was dead and found in a car, she didn't have to have walked up the stairs. She could have been in the car and driven there, or someone could have brought her there. But the police established that she had walked up by looking at the slippers. If you read the paper, it said her slippers were not scuffed at all. Well, that got me wondering why. And in time, I discovered that there was a strong friendship between William Randolph Hearst, who was the owner and publisher of the newspaper, and the motion picture industry, and particularly the heads of the studios. And eventually, I began to see that there had to have been a very elaborate cover-up. And then I went looking for people who might have been around in that time. And I started by interviewing librarians at the Motion Picture Academy, they have a library, big library there, at the Hollywood Reporter and so forth. And I was directed to a gentleman named Hal Roach. Who remembers Hal Roach? King of comedy. Well, Thelma Todd was under contract to him. And his studio, Hal Roach Studios, was on the lot of MGM. and all of his financing and distribution came through MGM. Because in those days, he was doing two-reelers, short comic shorts, Laurel and Hardy, Pitts and Todd, and others. So two or three people said to me, go find Hal Roach. He's still alive. He might talk to you. So I found Hal Roach, and for 6 months we played footsie on the phone. Oh, I'm not feeling well. Oh, I'm going out of town. Oh, I'm having guests in. Eventually I cornered him, and I went up there with Kathy Mader. I never said to him what I want to talk about. I just said I was a reporter. I was working on a book, which was not quite true. We didn't do a book on that. So we went up to his home in Stone Canyon. He was 95 years old. He really went for the young chicks. His girlfriend was only 70. And he welcomes us into his study, on the walls of which was an impossible number of celebrity pictures. He began in 1912 as a horseman, an extra in an Oder, a cowboy movie, silent movie. And he asked us to sit down, and he had his maid bring us tea. And then he said, you're here because of Thelma Todd. He told us. He said, I'll tell you about Thelma Todd. And he told me all about it, told both of us about it. We didn't have to ask him very many questions. He gave us her whole life story up to the time that she was killed, from the time she got to Hollywood until the time she was killed. And she told us who killed him and why. And it turned out he was the last living member of the cover-up. And he told us, this is all he told us about the cover-up. 4 days after her body was found, he was in his office, and 3 sheriff detectives wearing big hats came to his office and said, Thelma Todd has been murdered, and Roland West did it. What do you think we should do about that? What do you think we should do about that? And he said, oh, nothing, I guess. He'll get the best lawyers and he'll get off. So why make a scandal? How's our 30 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. We have to interrupt the filming at 30-minute intervals so that he can turn it off and turn it on. So they said, yeah, that's what we thought, and they left. So this left me with more questions than I could possibly answer. Why, first of all, would they ask him that? And secondly, why would the sheriff's office be investigating what was an LAPD case? Well, it turns out that the sheriff's office has the authority to take a case from the city because the county is a higher level of state government. Why would they ask him that? So I poked around in the files at USC's, not the morgue, but they have an enormous amount of documents there. And I discovered that Nicholas Schenck, who was the head of MGM, was the younger brother of Joseph Schenck, who was the head of 20th Century Fox. And Joseph Schenck was the most powerful man in the movie business. He was the founder of the Motion Picture Association of America, which continues to this day. He was the first president. He was basically a president for as long as he was alive. He was the largest property owner in the state of California. He was vice chairman of the California Republican Party. He could have been the chairman, but that took a lot of work. So that made me think, okay, so the fix was in, but why would he do that? And then I discovered that his best friend was Roland West, the man who killed her. Now the last question was, why would the sheriffs do this? So I did a little more poking around, and I found that Sheriff Eugene Biscaloos, who was sheriff here for 32 years, longer than anybody's ever been, probably longer than anybody will be again, had been the undersheriff and 4 years before this had run against the incumbent sheriff and lost. Thereupon, the state highway commissioner got the state assembly to fund a highway patrol. There had not been a highway patrol, and Biscaluz was appointed the commander of the highway patrol. 4 years later, he ran against the incumbent sheriff and won. Well, who was the highway commissioner? Joe Skegg was the highway commissioner, and the vice chairman of the Republican Party of the state of California, and the head of MGM. I'm sorry, and the head of 20th Century Fox, and the best friend of Roland West. And that explains how all of these things were covered up. And there's nobody in the business better than telling a story than the Hollywood people. So they created a false story. They had people come up and perjure themselves in front of the jury. And that's how they solved the book.
What year was that again?
What year was that?
What year was the murder?
Yeah.
1936.
And how old was Thelma when she was killed?
How old was Thelma when she was killed?
36.
What happened to Roland West?
What happened to Roland West?
Roland West became a zombie. He became a man who couldn't get a job. He produced and directed, he was a director, a number of films under other names. But no, his penance was that nobody would hire him under his own name. And he is kind of, if this had not happened, you would know who Roland West was, because he was a guy who invented a number of genres, film genres. The suspense genre, that was Roland West's contribution.
All right.
Let's take a little break right
Okay,
here.
we'll take a break.
About 1 minute left.
We shut it off and start it
That's
again,
it.
please. I would stretch.
Yeah, but you're still on.
Anybody who wants to stretch, man. Okay, in collaboration, is there any expectation of confidentiality?
Well, every deal is different, and it depends on whether you're collaborating to write a true crime book, which is an anthology. I did 3 of those, in which there isn't any expectation of privacy because you're not reporting or writing the story of your partner. But generally speaking, every biography that I have done as a collaboration, our agreement has specified that the information provided for the book belongs to the person who provided it until the book is published, of course. What you really have to anticipate is the fact that you may not finish the book, one party may pull out. So if that's the case, yes, anything, and in fact I have had a couple of projects like that, anything that is told to you for use in this book, if it's not used in the book, or if the book is never published, yes, there is an expectation of privacy.
I was thinking more though, is there an expectation or is there an agreement that you not reveal that you're the ghostwriter, or is that always known and is your name on the book? And
In ghostwriting, and this is a general ghostwriting question,
Yes,
really.
right.
The answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. The question was whether it is revealed that you are the ghostwriter, am I paraphrasing you correctly, or is that kept confidential? In your case, how did that go?
Well, I have 5 ghost-written books. One was about a very mundane subject, finding funding for grants in academia, and I was completely anonymous in that. One was a rather long and interesting book about lookism, which is, if you all know what racism is, lookism is the same thing, discrimination based on physical appearance. That's lookism. And that was a book that I was given a credit buried with about 100 others, on page 11 of the acknowledgments. But as far as the publisher is concerned, I had nothing to do with it. I was a true ghost. Then there were 2 novels that I ghost wrote from outlines by someone who had trouble with outlines. And I was completely a ghost in that, just completely invisible. So the answer is every circumstance is different. The guy that I wrote these 2 novels for, that's what he had in him. He had 2 outlines. And now what he does is he has a corduroy jacket with patches on the elbows, and he goes to writers' conference and talks about his books. But I got the money.
So do you tend to get paid more if your name is on the book or if your name is off the book?
I would think that you would get more. It's really what the market will bear. I did not have to have my name on Leonard Goldenson's book, but he told me that he wanted it on there. I didn't have to have my name on Russell Means' book, but I demanded it. It's a whole other story, which maybe you'll ask me about.
I will. That's one of them.
Yeah. In general, the difference is one is a ghost and the other is a collaborator. A collaborator should expect to get less because you're going to get some credit.
Right. And we do ghostwriting panels from time to time. So now we are the independent writers of Southern California. Independent writer, that has the term has kind of changed over the years, as has the expectation of success. How would you define a successful independent writer?
How would I define it? What?
A successful independent writer.
A successful independent writer is one that can pay the rent.
Yes.
That's a successful writer. If you don't have to, even if you have to have a day job, but you write because you want to, or because you must, and for the satisfaction of it, I would define that as successful. If you are locked up in your little garret and you can't pay the rent, I wouldn't say that was successful.
Okay.
So, your writing career, which is just getting underway after 50 years of actually doing it, because there's another 50 coming.
Oh, oops.
Yeah. You've written books, you've written magazine articles about everything that I've ever heard of. It says here, from a missing alligator, which is one I had not heard, from you anyway, to a guy who delivers ice, to illegal Japanese business practices, to solving the murder of Thelma Todd. So you don't seem to specialize. And why is that?
I specialize in not specializing. I guess there's 2 reasons. Half of it is I really am curious about almost everything. Some things more than others, but I really am curious about things. I get wrapped up in reading and researching stuff that will never be a book, but I just find it interesting. And the second reason is, as I said, people keep coming to me. They approach me. I got an email 3 days ago, and I don't know whether I'm going to do this. My agent, at this point in my career, my agent has a veto. If he doesn't think he can sell it, I'm not going to waste my time. But I was approached secondhand through a good friend of mine, a guy I've known 50 years, who was probably the best known author of the Vietnam War. Joe Galloway wrote a wonderful, wonderful book called We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And Joe is very busy now with the 50th anniversary celebration of the Vietnam War, and with writing his own memoirs when he's not playing poker online. Yes, I got that from his wife. I didn't know it myself. Anyway, he sent me an email from a guy that had approached him, and this guy, whose name I don't recall at the moment, but I have it written down, this has only been a couple of days, is an appellate judge in Nevada. In Vietnam, he was the guy who replaced Lieutenant Calley. He was the guy who took over Calley's platoon after Calley rotated home. Remember, nothing happened to Calley. No word of this, no disciplinary action until many months after the My Lai massacre. And so the story was, he took over this platoon and somebody one of his men tried to kill him that night. I don't know why, that's as much as I know about it. The fact that it was Calley, Rusty Calley was his nickname, that interests me, is that he took over his platoon. If you think about it, it's a platoon of killers. Almost all of them participated in the massacre, even though Calley is the only one who was held to account, and not very much of that either. So I might follow up on this, but I have to let Doug Grad, my agent, tell me whether he thinks I can sell it. More than likely, he'll tell me, talk to the guy and come back to me with a few paragraphs.
Okay, so you call yourself a recovering photographer.
I don't just call myself, I am.
Okay, you am a recovering photographer. So how does that fit in to your writing life?
Not much anymore.
Okay.
I'm a recovering photographer because there came a time when I had to become a writer, because I couldn't be a single dad and a photographer. I couldn't be a photographer who would get a phone call at 6 in the morning, that's 9 o'clock New York time, saying, can you be in Las Vegas by noon, your time? I couldn't do it. I had a 14-year-old daughter, and she needed someone to be home to supervise her. So fortunately, I had some writing skill. By that time, I'd actually written a book, but I still thought of myself as a photographer. I hadn't decided to become a writer. The book kind of found me. So for the next several years, I did some photography. But as time went on, photography and photographers changed. When I became a photographer, you had to know quite a bit of technical stuff, because very few photographers had a light meter, and those who did have a light meter, it wasn't in the camera, and the camera didn't focus automatically. And you had choices about film, remember film? And shutter speed, and lens aperture, and choice of lens. There's all these things you had to know about, and on top of that, you had to be at a certain place at a certain time and bring back something that nobody else maybe was able to get. That's all changed now. Anybody with a cell phone can be a photographer. But at the time that we're speaking of, in the mid-'80s, actually, mid to late 80s, magazines were beginning to disappear. The big magazine circulation was falling, TV was taking their advertising money, and so what they were paying photographers was less. They would want you to go out and shoot 5 hours, and they'd pay plus 2 hours travel each way, and they'd pay you half a day's rate. And also, it was getting to be, you needed more and more equipment. This is still the film era. Everything had to be lit. If you wanted to go out to take a portrait of a CEO, you used to be able to put him in front of a window with a reflector and get away with it. Not by then. And photographers were getting less and less and working more and more. And it just looked like I was never going to be the world's greatest photographer. I was a journeyman photographer. Not a bad photographer, but not a great photographer. On the other hand, I was just beginning to feel my oats as a writer. So I had to make a choice. But I never entirely gave up photography. It's whether I'm shooting for work or not, I'm shooting.
And many of us have seen some of your work, and it's beautiful.
Thank
You have really great stuff. So, and if you haven't seen Marvin's work, you should. Is it online? Do you have stuff online?
Some is, yes.
Okay.
I recommend it highly. Okay, so how do you handle failure? You must have experienced failure sometime in your life.
You mean rejection?
I've experienced far more failure than success, please believe me. One of the things that keeps me going is I know I can do the work. The question always is, can you find the work? And my low point was about 8 or 9 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. I had about $300 in the bank. I had a mortgage payment of $1,100 coming. I had cashed in my life insurance already. I had cashed in all of my stocks and bonds. Yes, I actually had stocks and bonds. I couldn't refinance my house because I had no income at the moment. And on top of that, I had torn my meniscus in my left knee, and I was flat on my back with excruciating pains in my left thigh. The doctor told me that it was a slip disc, but it wasn't. And I had days lying there saying, how am I going to pay the bills? What's going to happen here? And then one day I hobbled over to get the mail, and there was a check for $43,000. And the next day there was a check for $8,000. Two different people. These were guys I had been talking to. There's two of my ghostwriting jobs. I've been talking to off and on for years, literally years. One guy I talked to for 7 years. This was the guy who had the book on lookism. And the name of the book is Looks, Why Do They Matter? So that got me whole. That was my low point. But there have been times when I've had to go and consciously stare at the award plaques and say, you were once a pretty good writer, you could do this again. And the other thing about dealing with failure is you have to just accept that it's part of the business. If you are a baseball player, you expect to not get on base 7 times out of 10. If you're a very good baseball. It's a tough business, but part of it is developing an attitude of self-confidence, knowing that somehow you'll prevail if you don't quit. If you don't just lock yourself in your bedroom and watch sitcoms. Not that there's anything wrong with sitcoms.
Yeah, so failure, rejection, that's true for any job, any part of life. But with writing, we take it a little more personally. I mean, because it's us that's coming out onto the page. So kudos to you for handling it. Speaking of handling, how did your life in the service influence your writing?
How much time do we have? A lot, in many different ways. Let me divide this into 3 categories. My first 3 years and 2 months in the Army was entirely spent in the infantry. And what you learn in the infantry is you can walk or run or crawl a lot farther than you think you can when you have to. The other thing you learn in the infantry is discipline. You learn to, if you're a squad leader, and for a while, about the middle of that 3 years, I was, and you're out in the field at night, and you have a guard, and the guards are supposed to be on duty for 2 hours, and then next guy is supposed to take their place. They're supposed to wake up their relief. If you don't check on them, they ain't going to do it. They're gonna go to sleep on you. So you have to come to rely on yourself and believe in yourself. You have to believe that you are the equal or better of any man in your squad. And I have to tell you, quite frankly, that being as short as I am, that hasn't always been easy. But I learned it. You know, you're not judged by the size of the man in the Army. You're judged on what you can do and how well you do it. It's a pure meritocracy. So that was that first 3 years. The second part of this was my year and 3 months in Vietnam. And I had the good fortune, to, number one, work for the best public information officer of his era, and maybe the best ever, a man by the name of Charles Seiler, who not only was a professional in every sense, he had enormous integrity. I stood at attention next to him as he told the full colonel, the chief of staff of the 1st Cavalry Division, that he would not lie for the Army. He flat wouldn't do it, and if they didn't like it, they could send him down to an infantry battalion. You don't find that very often in men, and it was a great lesson to me. 3 years later, I had the same kind of job he had in the 7th Infantry Division, and I was asked to lie, and I gave the same response, expecting to go down to an infantry company, but I wasn't sent. I told the guy what he needed to hear. So I had that great role model. Secondly, in Vietnam, again, this is the start of the war, 65 and 66, and we were the feature attraction in those years. The 1st Cavalry was. We were the first time that soldiers had flown into battle in something as complicated and thin-skinned as a helicopter, and the press wasn't quite sure what was going to happen, so they showed up to take pictures and ask questions. I met the Queen of the International Press Corps. I worked with them. I escorted them, I asked them questions, I watched, I listened, I learned. You could not have had a better school. Just not possible. And even the guys in my section, the soldiers in my section, were some very professional reporters. I learned the rudiments of news reporting from Joseph Treaster, who after he got out of the Army, he stayed in Vietnam and worked for the New York Times and spent 44 years at the New York Times. You don't spend that long at the New York Times unless you're a damn good reporter and you like living in New York. Finally, I had and this really impacts on books, I had the great good fortune to escort John Steinbeck for a week in Vietnam and be the proverbial fly on the wall, watch him work. It was very instructive. A more humble man you would never meet. You would never know that he was a Nobel Prize winner. In fact, he instructed me not to tell anyone his last name because he didn't want to talk about himself. He wanted to listen to what they had to say. I also did the same thing for a man named S.L.A. Marshall, Samuel Lyman Atwood Marshall. If you're of a certain age, you will know that he was a very well-regarded military writer going back to World War II. He was also a fraud and a liar, and I found that out too. And I had the great pleasure of showing him up for a fraud and a liar, but it was never something I set out to do. It just happened. So if you spend a year in the company of those kinds of people, men and women, you get a great picture of what this business is about and who the people in. And I once had lunch with 3 Pulitzer Prize winners, 4 if you count the fact that one of them won the award twice. And they're just people, you know, they're guys. They have a certain attitude. They're going to do what they're going to do. Nothing's going to stop them. That's a great thing to have. And finally, as you get up in rank in the Army or any military service, people give you mission assignments. They don't tell you how to get a job done. They just tell you get it done. And the first time this happened was in Vietnam. I was a brand new sergeant. Well, I was a brand new sergeant for the second time. And we had a horrible, horrible slit trench on our little forward base, which was believe it or not, in a cemetery. This is landing zone dog. And a man named Henri Hewitt was a prince of a man, a wonderful man and an amazing photographer, had to relieve himself using this slit trench. Just imagine a slit trench 8 inches wide and 6 or 7 feet long. And the problem was that Henri Hewitt's mother was Vietnamese and he had skin the color of tea. And the headquarters commandant sent his first sergeant out to tell Henry Hewitt that he couldn't poop in our slit trench. That it was only for U.S. forces. And my boss grabbed me and he said, take anybody you need, find any resources you need. I want to find a shit house in Vietnam and I want it by dark. So I did. I had never built a latrine before, anywhere, but I'd been in my share. And I had some pretty good people working for me, and so we went and we did it. We scrounged the materials, and we did it. And when we got all done, and this is the best lesson there is, Major Seiler said, it just needs a sign. And I said, well, what should the sign say? PIO personnel only? He said, no! Your sign should say, this latrine is available to anyone. First guy to use it was the headquarters commandant.
So to become a successful writer, you build a latrine.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Wonderful. Now, this could be another kind of long but really interesting story. Handling personalities when you're writing a biography. I'm thinking Russell Means.
You want me to tell you about Russell Means? Oh, God. Let's take another one of those little breaks.
5 more minutes.
You have 5 minutes? That's okay. Shut it down and we'll start again. I'll just stand up for a minute.
Okay.
Before I dive into the cesspool called Russell Means, Ina asked me to say why Thelma Todd was killed. Strictly speaking, it was, I would, putting on my lawyer's hat, I would say it was probably manslaughter, not murder. She lived with Roland West. They, for propriety's sake, because he was married to someone else, they had a large sliding door between their apartments between their bedrooms in an apartment above a restaurant on Pacific Coast Highway that she and West owned together. He was a possessive man and she was a free spirit. And there came a time when she was supposed to, she'd been invited to a party at a nightclub, the Trocadero, and he wanted her to be around at the restaurant because he had an appointment to see the Skouras brothers. Skouras brothers are the people who wound up buying a controlling interest in 20th Century Fox, but I wouldn't expect many people to know that these days. And he asked her to be home by 10 o'clock, and she said, no, I'll come and go as I please. And he said, 10 o'clock. She said, 11 o'clock. He said, 10 o'clock. She said, midnight. He said, 10 o'clock. She said, maybe I won't come home at all. She got home about 3 o'clock in the morning. Her driver, she had a chauffeur, she had been forbidden to drive by the studio. She had a bad habit of wrapping cars around lampposts or palm trees. Her driver usually walked up a dozen steps to the door to the apartment, but this time she told him not to because she was expecting a scene. So he left, and she found out in a moment that he had locked it, Roland West had locked her out. He had thrown the bolt on the inside. So she pounds on the door and pounds on the door and pounds on the door, and finally he answers and he said, I told you to come home at 10 o'clock. So now you're just going to have to fend for yourself. And they had a big fight through the door, a screaming match, and she said, I'll just go to another party. She starts to climb these steps. Roland West throws on some clothes and follows her. When he gets to the top of the hill where the garage is located, she's already behind the wheel of her car and the engine is running. He locks the door to the garage. He's going to teach her a lesson. And then he goes back down and goes to sleep. The next morning, which is Sunday morning, about 8 o'clock, he walks back up the steps, locks the garage and finds her dead. He takes the lock. This garage was rarely locked, almost never. He takes the lock off the hasp, goes back down, and starts calling around to establish an alibi. So that's what happened. Let's go to Russell Means now. Russell Means was, in his day, probably the most famous living American Indian. He died about 2.5 years ago. In 1970s, he was a leader, 60s and 70s actually, a leader of what became known as the American Indian Movement, which was essentially a very militant civil rights group advocating for Native American rights. He and Dennis Banks, were the two leaders of the takeover by the American Indian Movement of the Wounded Knee village on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in 1973. When I met him, he had just finished his first movie. The movie was called Last of the Mohicans, and he was the second lead after Daniel Day-Lewis. I suspect even before then he was very full of himself, but I don't know because I didn't know him before that. My agent asked me to come to a meeting at the Spitfire restaurant on the Santa Monica Airport, which was 5 minutes from my house. And I met him and my agent and a man named Quay Hayes. Quay Hayes was a young man who had started a celebrity book publishing company, and this was too big a book for him to publish. He just didn't have the money to properly promote it. So he decided to serve as packager. And as packager, he would give a completed, edited manuscript to the publisher. And the editing would be done by a man by the name of Murray Fisher. Murray Fisher was Alex Haley's editor on Roots, and also before that on the autobiography of Malcolm X. And before that, Alex Haley wrote the first Playboy interview, the very first one. It wasn't a Playboy interview until he got a guy who nobody ever talked to, who wouldn't talk to reporters, to talk to him. And in a moment, I'll think of his name.
Rock, the head of the American
Was it?
Nazi Party. The head of the American Nazi Party, wasn't it?
George Lincoln Rockwell?
Yeah, George Lincoln Rockwell.
George Lincoln Rockwell?
No, not George Lincoln Rockwell. His most famous album in my mind, he was a musician. Sketches of Spain. He was
Miles Davis?
Miles Davis, thank you very much. Having a senior moment. Started about a year now. Miles Davis sat for an interview with Alex Haley, and when that came in over the transom at Playboy, where Murray Fisher was an editor, they created the Playboy interview to have a way to show this. So he's a very good editor, and I learned a great deal from him. But he was also in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and he didn't know it. So after a while, it became apparent he had serious memory problems. When I met Russell, it was at this restaurant, and I never got a chance to ask him anything. He just started making statements. And some of these statements sounded very outrageous, and many of them were partly true, some were not true, but most of them, even the most outrageous ones, turned out to be true. What I knew about American Indians at that point was what I had seen in the movies, and I knew that most of that was crap. It just wasn't true. So I didn't concern myself, I didn't tell myself that I knew anything about American Indians. And I think he appreciated that, because as it turned out, he'd interviewed 3 previous writers, and they'd all try to argue with him. Before he let me go, he asked me if I was a Christian, and I had to say that I wasn't. And I asked him why, and he said, the Christians stole the language from my people, from the Indians. That's true. They forced children into English language school, and punished them for speaking in their native language. and he didn't want anything to do with Christians. He's a very opinionated guy. I didn't know how big an asshole he was. He was plenty big. Plenty big as I've ever met. He could be extremely charming. He could charm the pants off a waitress. I saw him do it more than once. He liked waitresses. But he didn't limit himself to waitresses. He was a sex addict, what can I tell you? I'm skipping way ahead. When we went on our book tour, first you did the publisher's book tour, more about which is later, and then we did our own book tour. And what we did is I lined up speaking engagements at 22 bookstores in California in 12 days. And we drove up the coast to Vallejo, where he spent much of his childhood, and then drove back down through the Central Valley. And along the way, he discovered he had 9 more children than he thought he did. This is not a joke. It happened the same time, same way each time. At the very end of the talk, after he'd read from the book and talked and taken questions and signed the books, and we were packing up, and everybody except me and him had gone, a young man or woman, late teens, early 20s, would show up. They'd look at their feet, which is the polite way if you're an Indian, you don't look your elder in the eye, and they'd mumble something like, "Mom says you're my dad." And he was very gentle with them. He'd ask their names, he'd ask their mother's name, he'd speak to them at great length, he'd take their contact information. And finally, when we'd leave, he said, "I don't know who that woman is. I never met her. She probably doesn't know who it was," so she told him it was Russell Means. But by the middle of the next day, he would remember her. And then he would give the kid a car or something. He made a lot of money in the time that I was with him, and he was always broke. He was always borrowing money from me. We were supposed to do this book in a year, but he had serious second thoughts about ever doing it. After we signed the contract, and each of us got about $18,000, which was the first installment on a $125,000 advance, he disappeared for 4 months. He disappeared for 4 months. I found him twice. He was on the set of 2 different movies, and when I finally got him on the line, he wouldn't talk to me. I said, "The clock is ticking. We're supposed to turn the book in a year." He said, "What are they going to do to me? Sue me? I live on an Indian reservation. I live in a trailer that belongs to my wife. Sue me." I said, "Wait, they'll sue me too." "Ah," he said, "that's your problem." Russell Means. It gets better and worse. I wasn't going to just sit on my hands for 4 months. I actually didn't know how long it was going to be, 4 months. I had to do something, so I had been provided with 2 resources. One of them was a set of newspaper and magazine clippings, anything that had mentioned him over about the last 20 years. Some of it was Nexus, actually. Well, some of it was Lexus too, because there's a lot of court cases. He'd been arrested 13 times at that point. No, it was 13 times in 1 year. A lot he'd been arrested. But anyway, other thing I had was that Murray Fisher had done 3 long interviews with him, and then I decided that he was not the right guy to write a book. That he was a better editor than a writer. That's when he started looking for somebody else to write. And I had those transcribed interviews. So I sat down and I made a list of all the places and the approximate dates where something important that had been in the newspaper had happened. And then I got on a plane and I flew to Rapid City and I rented a car and put 4,000 miles on it in 15 days. I went as far east as Minneapolis, as far west as the Valley of the Little Bighorn, the Custer site. I talked to 4 of his ex-wives. he had a current wife. I didn't talk to her then. Four of his ex-wives, including one, there was really a marriage in name only, was that she could visit him in prison. I talked to his aunt, who is the last person of her generation in his family. And I talked to two of his sons, including one that had just escaped from the prison in Sioux Falls and was wanted for murder. But I didn't know it at the time. He just asked me to give him a ride to Rapid City. He was with the younger brother. And about halfway there, I found out he had been on a one day parole, and he just left. He just didn't go back. Apparently they do that in South Dakota. They let people out if they've had good disciplinary records for a day or two. So he just took off. And then they asked to borrow money from me, so I had to give it to him, of course. They were sitting in the back of my rented car. But it was all good. And I went to look for his mother's grave, his mother's grave, in a town of Yankton, which is an Indian reservation. It's pretty much been abandoned. And I didn't find it, but I found a 12-foot high treaty obelisk that had the names of all the chiefs that had signed, of the Yankton Sioux that had signed the treaty in 1858, and all the guys who had refused to sign. One of them was his great-great-great-grandfather. And out of that experience, I was able to sit down and write 100 pages before he ever came back. And I showed them to Murray Fisher, and he put his pencil on them and gave them back to me, and I fixed his edits. And when Russell came back, he called me, I had no idea he was coming back, and said, okay, let's have our interview. So I took the 100 pages with me, and I went to see him. And I said, in your absence, I have done this, and I explained what I just told you, and I've written 100 pages. And he blows up. That's not what I wanted you to do. I had an outline. I said, no, I never saw any outline. Yeah, I showed it to you. Opens his wallet and gives me a greasy envelope that's been folded 40 times, and it's got a third grader topic outline, 1, A, B, C. It starts with grammar school. And he takes the 100 pages and throws them out the window of his hotel. And I left. Unknowns to me, the next minute after I left, he went down and got the pages. And he put them back in right order, and he took them to the noted drama critic, Margot Kidder, who is actually a very smart woman, very bright woman, also bipolar, but that's a whole other story. She had been his co-star in one of the movies he was making, and she read the 100 pages and gushed and said, oh, Russell, I didn't know you could write like this. This is wonderful. So I could talk about him for several hours, but I think you get the picture. He just kept sabotaging himself over and over and over again. He kept making me jump through hoops. And at a certain point, he actually quit the project, and it was up to me to get him back because nobody else had as much invested. If I didn't finish this book, I'd have to give the money back. If I didn't give the money back, I'd never get another book contract. And I didn't have the money.
But he wasn't actually raised on the reservation? He said he grew up in Vallejo.
Well, the question was he raised on a reservation? Yes or no? He grew up he was born on the Pine Ridge Reservation and lived there until he was 5. Then when World War II came along, his father got a job in the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, and then he moved there.
That's all you
But he went back and forth visiting family. But he really wasn't a child of the reservation.
So you are the oldest living TV writer ever broken into the TV writing. I don't mean that in a bad way. So how did you pull that off?
Well, I have to start by saying it was the biggest mistake of my career. I had finished a book. I had finished the book with Win Kao Key, his war memoir called Buddha's Child, and I turned it in on the Monday of the week before the 4th of July. I don't remember the date, of 2001. And my editor called me and said, I'm going to be traveling all summer. My editor was Bob Weil, the editor-in-chief at St. Martin's Press. And he said, it might be Labor Day before I get back to you. I'm going to read it a couple of times and I'll have notes for you. So don't call me, I'll be out of town. I'll get back to you right after Labor Day. So now what am I going to do for the summer? Fish got to swim, birds got to fly. I got to write or take pictures, but something. Something happened to me when I was in the Army, a terrible thing, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's not really important to the story, but it was pretty rotten, and I thought it might make a movie. A friend of mine, a softball friend of mine I've been playing ball with at that point for close to 20 years, I didn't even know his last name at that point, but Larry Mintz. I knew he was a TV writer, and what I didn't know was that when he got to be about 40, he couldn't get arrested in Hollywood. He couldn't get any more work. He made a lot of money. He wrote a lot of sitcoms, but his agent told him to reinvent himself. That was all he knew. He knew how to write sitcoms, and in fact, as it turned out, he really didn't know how to write sitcoms. He knew how to tell someone else how to do it. I mean, he really did know how to tell someone else how to do it. He could listen to a scene and tell you what was wrong with it, but he couldn't tell you how to fix it. He could tell you what was wrong with it. A very honorable and smart man. All I knew about him was that he was a screenwriter, and I knew nothing about writing for the screen. So at a softball game, I said, Larry, let me take you to lunch. I want to pitch you something. So we had lunch, and I started up by saying, I'm going to tell you a story. If you think this would be a movie, then I'd like to talk to you about collaborating. If you don't think it's a movie, then fine, we just had lunch. So I told him the story in about 5 minutes, and he said, the first thing we need is a whole stack of 3x5 cards. And his notion was to do an outline on 3x5 cards. I had electronic 3x5 cards, which I prefer to use. It's just a little way of putting it's done on the computer, and you just do the notes and you can move them around. So that was how we got started on that. And we did not sell that, and maybe probably won't ever sell it, but it got us an agent. I have to say, an over-the-hill agent who was in her twilight minutes. She's about to become a manager. Manager can participate in the income stream from a production. An agent just gets a commission from whoever he represents or she represents. But anyway, for a few weeks we had an agent, and we wrote another one on spec based on a childhood experience of mine, and that one got optioned by the Hallmark Channel, and they paid us to rewrite it, and they didn't use it. It's a whole other story, but that's the business. And I spent 9 years in the business, and I wrote about 15 scripts with Larry, and 2 of them were produced, and we had another one option. And I discovered that 63 is not the right age to start in the movie business. No agent wants you. They want somebody in their 20s who has maybe 15 years experience. They want somebody that they can pee on and tell them that it's raining, and will believe it. The problem that we had when we went to meetings is someone, frankly, young enough to be my son or even my grandson, would tell us something that we knew to be untrue, and we say, wait a minute, that's bullshit. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to go to meetings with people their parents' age, because people their parents' age are not intimidated by them. So I kind of regret the 9 years I spent in the movie business, because I could have written 5 books in that time and made some money. Anything else?
Let that be a lesson to you. All right, we're going to have one more question here, and then we're going to do some cake in the back.
Cake!
Cake. We're kind of running out of time because they're going to kick us out fairly soon. So and it's about 5. It is about 5.
5 minutes.
Can you tell us the bicycle story in 5 minutes?
Can I tell you what?
The bicycle story in
Yes.
5 minutes?
Yes. When I was 9, I had to get a job. My father was too sick to work, and I found a guy in Chicago named Mr. Michelli, who had a paper distribution business, and I asked him if I'd get a paper out, and he said, talk to me for a few minutes, and then he said, show me your bicycle. I said, well, it's at home. I didn't have a bicycle. And I didn't know how to ride a bicycle, and neither of my parents knew how to ride a bicycle, because both of my parents were orphans, and no one ever showed them how to ride a bicycle. But the guy didn't ask to see the bicycle, he just asked to see me ride the bicycle, he just asked to see the bicycle. So we borrowed a bicycle, and I showed it to him, and I got the job. And for about a week, I put the papers up on the handlebars and pushed the bicycle. It's not an easy way to do things. My mother then took pity on me and gave me her folding shopping cart, and I delivered from the shopping cart. Now here's the deal. If you're on a bicycle and you throw in newspapers, one chance. You miss, too bad. Lands in a puddle, too bad. Missed the second floor porch, too bad. But if you're in a cart, you get all the chances you want. If it's too heavy, a Sunday paper, too heavy to throw up to a third store porch, you carry it up. So, over about a year and a half's time, I built that route from 29 customers to 59 customers. Not because of anything special I did, but just people would stop me in the street and ask to take the paper. It was the Chicago American, which is a Hearst paper. Long gone now. The way the business worked for me, for paper boys, is that we had to pay for our papers on Friday. And we were paid a penny a paper a day and 5 cents for the weekend paper, Sunday paper, big Sunday papers. So I would collect on Thursday night. On the Thursday night before Christmas, and this would have been 1950 or 51, I went out, and my route was 2 blocks, both sides of the street. I knocked on the first of my customer's door, and I heard music inside, but nobody came to the door. So I went on to the next door, and nobody was home. And the next door, I'm in the middle of the first block, I haven't found a single customer home. And there are lights on the block. I see people getting in and out of their cars, coming back from the store, shopping, but none of my customers are home, and I'm in a state of panic. Absolute panic. Because if I don't pay for my papers, I could lose this job. And although I was only making about $9 a week, and all of it, except for $1, which I got to keep, went to my parents, I don't want to lose this job. You can imagine, a 9-year-old kid panicked. I get to the last house in the second block. This is my favorite customers. It was the Gordons. It was a pair of identical Italian twins who were gorgeous. They were not, of course, married to the same man. They were married to 2 different men. But Mrs. Gordon had downstairs, and her sister was upstairs. So I knock on the Gordon's door. I hear music and noise and talking, and the door is open, and her husband all but drags me inside. And there in her living room are every one of my customers. All of them, crammed into this living room. And I didn't know what to say. And then Mrs. Gordon came out. She escorts me to the middle of the room, and she said, "You're the best paper boy we ever had." And she lauds me for 5 minutes. I'm not going to spend the 5 minutes lauding me. I did good, okay, so they liked it. And then she said, "We've all seen you out there in the rain and the snow with that little shopping cart, and we think you ought to have a bicycle." And they had pitched in and bought me a bicycle.
Wow.
which I had to walk home. And when I got it home, and I had schlepped it up the stairs, the second floor over the butcher shop, there was a bag, paper bag, and in that paper bag was a card from every one of my customers with their dues and a tip.
Oh, my.
And it happened, my father had just lost his job again. My father was in the sheet metal business. And there was a little over $100 in tips. It was a fortune in 1950.
Oh,
yeah.
It was a month's pay.
Great story.
A month's pay. I mean, for a working man, not for me.
Yeah.
It was a year's
right.
pay for me.
Great stuff.
The next day, I go to work.
It's over.
You have to shut this.
Okay.
Next day, I go in to deliver my newspapers, and I pay that week's papers. And Mr. Michelli, who never talked to anybody, once he hires you, one of the kids runs everything. He came down from his loft. This was like a little apartment over a garage. And he said, "Come up here." And I, oh my God, I'm in trouble. So I went up there to see him, and he said, "What are you doing Saturday morning at 10 o'clock? I said, "Never mind. Bring your bicycle here, I'll show you how to ride it." True story.
Yeah.
True story that I have sold about 11 times, including the movie that I wrote, which didn't get produced.
Great story.
The Reader's Digest, selling the story to Reader's Digest and what you made.
Pardon me?
How much did you make from Reader's Digest?
$4,000.
600.
Well, a lot of bicycles for $4,000.
I guess all the sellings of this story added up, you said once, to 600 grand?
No. All together is about $12,000.
But that's close.
Marvin, we want to thank you for sharing your life with us for all of these years,
Yeah.
and your support and your friendship.
Can we do this again tomorrow?
Yes. And now it is time to cut the cake.